So happy to continue this conversation with Dr. Raj Shah. We're going to be speaking about energy access and electrification in Africa. They have some great new work that they've been doing on this effort. And I wonder, maybe let's just dive right in. I mean, tell us a little bit about the news that you guys had from last week on this. Yeah, what's the goal here?
Well, Tim, it's great to be with you, and I just want to say to everyone gathered here, it's so wonderful to be with you. Ngozi is such a hero for so many of us that have worked on these issues. And I'll tell you, back more than a decade ago, I worked at USAID. I ran USAID for President Obama, and he and I and others decided that the most important thing the United States could do with respect to our relationship with Africa was investing in electrification broadly. And the first person we turned to at that time was Ngozi to help us bring heads of state, ministers of finance, ministers of energy, technologists, young inventors, women and girls, civil society, everyone together to develop plans and programs to actually give people access to energy, because she believed that that was what was required to lift up communities. That was what was required to improve labor productivity. That was what was required to allow hospitals to have ultrasound and cold chain and lighting for safe births in their clinics. And importantly, that's what was required so schools could have lighting and energy and air conditioning and teach even at night. And her lesson and her leadership, I think, has set an extraordinary tone for the continent and for the world. And so taking an extra minute to just celebrate Ngozi is entirely appropriate. I will say what the Rockefeller Foundation, together with the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and credit to Countries First, announced in May a commitment to finally reach 300 million people in Africa with renewable electrification. And that project, now called Mission 300, is anchored in 15 countries. At the end of January, on the 27th and 28th of January, the heads of state of those 15 countries will gather in Tanzania to sign and make public compacts that describe the regulatory reforms, the policy reforms, the domestic investment they will make in electrifying their economies and reaching universal coverage in their nations. And partners like Rockefeller, the World Bank, the African Development Bank have committed $30 billion of public finance to make that happen between now and 2030. And folks, it is a race against time, because we are not making the kind of progress we need to make. This initiative, to be successful, we need to more than double the rate of electrification in sub-Saharan Africa, and it will have to ensure that there are resources for small businesses, entrepreneurs, hospitals, and schools to use that access to energy and electrification to lift their productivity and their living standards, and to create jobs. I was just in Nigeria in June, a country that has 3.7 million young people entering the workforce every year and an unemployment rate most likely over 30%. We simply are not going to have the jobs we need to absorb and help young African workers reach their full potential without access to electricity in a digital age. So I'm proud of this announcement.
Can you just say a little bit more about, since going back to this USAID goal you were speaking under Obama administration, what are some of the biggest challenges that we still see in terms of, why is it so difficult still to get, for example, more private investment going into these kind of renewable energy projects? Because we've seen in that amount of time, a huge change in the cost of solar, for example, has come way down. So why is it still so hard to finance these things?
So here's what's better and here's what's worse. What's worse, I'll start there, is the public financing environment. 10 years ago, there were net inflows of $225 billion from wealthy economies to developing countries to support public expenditure. Today, this year, there's a net outflow from developing economies to wealthy economies of $50 billion.
Wow.
Most of that is due to skyrocketing interest payments. There are more than 40 countries that are spending more on debt repayments abroad than they are on either educating their kids in their own country or providing healthcare services to their own populations. So the macro environment makes foreign direct investment very, very, very difficult. Here's what's good. What's good is what you said. Solar panels have come down 90% in cost. Battery technology you can't even really characterize because we didn't have the kind of long duration storage, lithium ion, robust battery systems that make these technologies viable. The net reality is today in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Uganda, in South Africa, we can provide solar plus battery, always on, reliable, productive power to small businesses for anywhere from 12 cents a kilowatt hour to 22 cents a kilowatt hour. And that compares to diesel backup generators that are loud, that are dirty, that are terrible to have to deal with. But most importantly, they're expensive, especially now, 80 cents, 90 cents a kilowatt hour. That is killing the African small business economy. And so in Nigeria, where 80% of all power consumed is consumed as diesel backup, at that price point, of course you have an macroeconomic crisis. So this is, we believe, the best chance we have to generate the kind of private investment alongside the 30 billion. The goal actually is to mobilize 90 billion total, 30 public, 60 private. Some of that 60 is from philanthropies, is philanthropic, but much of it has to come from local pension funds and local commercial banks with some guarantees from abroad.
Yeah. Okay. One question I want to ask you is about how the sort of demand picture in African countries is changing. One of the big themes from Climate Week, kind of around New York this week, has been about data centers and AI and the massive energy consumption that they require. And this is a challenge even in a sort of energy-rich country like the U.S. For African countries where we still see this big energy access gap, but of course they are also very keen to get into data centers. There's a lot of interest in developing that kind of IT economy there as well. Like, does that, is it possible to provide electricity for those things, or how do we see this sort of like demand kind of gap changing?
Well, so it is possible to provide electricity for those things, but most of the climate models that we've all relied on globally assume that in wealthy economies, energy demand tapers off and flattens, and developing economies, it goes up considerably, and that as it goes up, it'll shift to renewables. That's the underlying assumption set. None of that is actually happening. Mm-hmm. None of that is true.
Right.
The power is no longer going to flatten power demand in wealthy economies. As you just mentioned,
it's going up.
Data centers and AI alone have changed all the data models that all of us have been relying on for in just the last 18 months. Mm-hmm. And then in developing economies, there's this assumption that the change will happen. Mm. But over the last 20 years, for all the renewable energy that's built out all across the planet, less than 2% of it has been built in Africa. Less than 2%. We're not on path to get there. That's why we need new initiatives like Mission 300. It's why we need leadership from the World Bank. Ajay Banga, its new president, is doing a very good job of saying, look, let's focus our efforts on the driver of economic inclusion, on the driver of job creation, and on the systemic effort to lower the cost of doing business across the continent. Mm-hmm. And that will allow for economic vibrancy and rebirth. Yeah. Without that kind of leadership to focus our energies where it counts most, we're not going to get back on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One question about there's sort of we're sort of talking about two goals at the same time, with the sort of decarbonization and climate goals on one hand, also just pure energy access.
Yeah.
Is there any sense in which those things are in conflict? I mean, would it be easier to close this energy access gap just by building a lot of small gas turbines, or what do you see as the role for fossil fuels in this solution, if any?
So I think in particular in Africa, the use of gas and other fossil fuels will be persistent over the medium term and even the long term. It's very hard to call something transitional when it takes 5 to 7 years to build out the infrastructure. The financing depends on that infrastructure being operational for 30 years or 40 years. So there's really no such thing in my mind as like new transitional energy infrastructure. But for an economy like the African economy writ large, which has been so massively deprived of energy access, you will have to have an all of the above approach going forward. The key is this, is we can't continue to build out coal. That is by far the most damaging, and we have to get off diesel. And in both of those cases, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal are connected to batteries using smart meters, using microgrid and mini grid models that are integrated into the grid systems. These are new business models that have proven that they can be economically viable at supplying businesses, not just homes, not just turning a light on, which is important, but not productive in the same way. And we have to understand that new technology frontier and deploy it at scale.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say is because these tend to be smaller projects, relatively speaking, a push like Mission 300 is absolutely critical because it starts to build scale. We can get 25 developers together and say, let's all share in the procurement of batteries so we can get access to the global battery supply chain at 1/3 the cost. Let's share in the acquisition of solar panels and bring the price down. Africa still has, it's a systemically unfortunate thing where solar panels in Africa cost 130% what they cost elsewhere. Batteries cost 450% more in sub-Saharan Africa than that same battery does elsewhere for lithium ion. And the reason is it's because it's so disaggregated as a acquisition
supply chain.
supply chain. So we do a lot of that shared procurement through the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is the partnership that is making Mission 300 possible on the continent.
Maybe the last question, Raj, before we go. I mean, if you think ahead sort of 10 years or in the 2030, post-2030 time frame, is the goal ultimately that philanthropy or development banks can, or public finance can sort of play a lesser role in and stand up more of Africa's energy economy through private finance or companies, and what would sort of your message, I guess, be to private investors, either here looking abroad or African entrepreneurs in the energy sector, to kind of get more of that kind of private finance going into this space?
Well, I'd say the message to African entrepreneurs is easy. It's like, now is your moment. There is, you're about to have the kind of regulatory and policy clarity in 15 major sub-Saharan African economies that you've been asking for 2 decades. Hold your leaders to account, but they absolutely need to deliver that clarity by the end of January in the Tanzania summit. The public financing, no country on earth has ever achieved universal electrification without massive public financing. I say that as someone who loves seeing pictures of the Hoover Dam, okay? It's called the Hoover Dam because it was paid for by the government, right? And then we go to developing countries and we say, well, hey, we're not so sure we should spend public financing on your infrastructure. That's not fair. I mean, that's not fair. It's also not sensible given how every other economy on the planet developed its own sense of inclusion. So having this amount of dedicated public finance for electrification is unique, it's different, it's important, and frankly, it's our one chance to get it right. And then the final thing I'd say is to investors broadly, especially in dollar investors or euro investors. Right now there's a lot of macroeconomic risk, but you can use your capital in super efficient ways to enable local currency to be available at scale to the developers and businesses that need to power this revolution. And that's how I'd urge those folks to think about it. And then finally, I would say to other philanthropies, this is your chance. Like, everybody in philanthropy loves doing small pilot projects. The chance to actually come together, partner with others, grab a hold of $30 billion of public finance, work with heads of state who are changing their policies and regulations, and do something at scale that can transform human opportunity on the most important young continent on the planet. This is your moment to have impact, and if you care about results, please join us.
Great. Take those marching orders away with us. So Raj Shah, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.